Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Cambridge Union for one of our most exciting events, the long-term and psychological and societal impact of COVID on our community. I hope you can all hear me. I'm Millicent Stone. I'm a consultant rheumatologist and I'm an entrepreneur, and I went back as a postgraduate student to the Judge Business School to study entrepreneurship. So that's why I got involved in the Cambridge Union in an effort to fully embrace student life and put together this programme, which will be chaired by Professor Sir Simon Wesley. I hope you can all hear me in the chamber. Thumbs up. Excellent. And I'm currently in quarantine, actually, speaking of COVID, because of track and trace. So I would love to be there in the chamber with you, but I have joined my esteemed colleagues here on Zoom to participate tonight. Now, I would like to start, before I hand over to Professor Sir Simon Wesley as chair, by introducing the chair, because he really is a very interesting person, and I think he warrants and merits a proper introduction. Simon is a psychiatrist. He's a Regis psychiatrist, the first Regis psychiatrist ever to be appointed at King's College, and the first ever in psychiatry, and is an epidemiologist and has done much research on chronic fatigue syndrome and mental welfare of military personnel, and is extremely engaged in the COVID debate, both as a broadcaster with the Royal Society of Medicine, as an advisor, and indeed as a researcher, having published a number of amazing articles of late. Simon is an interdisciplinary worker, and this is a testament to how two of his lovely friends, Baroness Bull and Dame Jane Dacre and Paul Glynn and Dr. Alex Lyon are on this meeting, and it stands to the interdisciplinary nature. He's also a scholar of the arts, and back to his alma mater tonight in Cambridge, having done a degree in arts in Cambridge. And I learned in my little recce of Simon that he is a flautist. He plays the flute and comes from a family of musicians. His mother was a concert violinist and spent a lot of his time listening to his mother, apart from when he's out playing football with his two sons. We'll come back to that. He's well known in the media, not just as a broadcaster, but as somebody who's been interviewed. And I highly recommend the Desert Island Discs for a really interesting discussion and a listen of very eclectic and wide-ranging musical tastes. Now, Simon is not without his achievements, 800 odd publications and numerous awards. And in fact, the director of the BBC said his scientific life award was the best he'd ever seen. But finally, I come to the human side of Simon, and I would say that Simon is the ideal person to be put sitting beside at a dinner party, especially if it's a stuffy dinner party. And I was sitting beside Simon at a rather stuffy event. It's the only time I've met Simon in person, and honestly, I can still remember the conversation. It was great. He's entertaining, he's fun, he's educated, he's a family man. And the final thing you need to know about him is that he's a Chelsea fan. So let me hand over to my colleague, Professor Sir Simon Wesley, to introduce the panel and open tonight's proceedings. And I'll close them again when you finish shortly after 8. Thank you, Simon.
Well, thank you very much, Millie. I had to pay you a lot of money to say all that. It's really good. So, welcome to a packed house here at the Cambridge Union. Absolutely bursting at the seams with people. And in fact, we should do what they do at Ronnie Scott's, which is get you all to join hands and welcome the audience. So that will be you. So we will introduce ourselves as we go through the evening. Now, we've got a great panel. Now, this is a very weird presentation because I haven't done this before. And Millie, you told me this was a Hydra presentation. And I obviously misheard you, because the Hydra is a Greek female sea monster with multi-heads. And that's no way to introduce our first two guests, who are in fact completely different to that in every way. And the word you actually meant was hybrid. So it's a hybrid presentation, which is rather different. So we've got Deborah Bull, Baroness Bull. Now, I can't actually see you, but I'm told that you are ethereally present with us on a tiny screen that I can't see. Bottom left. Okay, I still can't see you, so I'm blind as a bat. Oh, there we are. I've got a bit of you there. I was looking completely the wrong bit. Very good, but still can't see much of you. Anyway, so Deborah Bull is, she's my boss, really. We keep changing the names. Are you a vice provost, vice principal, vice queen, deputy queen? I'm never quite sure. Which are you, Deborah?
I'm on mute, but I'm Vice President and Vice Principal for London.
Ah, right. Okay, university worlds are like that, aren't they? We change all the time. But most famous, originally, you were the principal ballerina at the Royal Ballet, and then you've had every cultural job going. You were the creative director of the Royal Opera House. You've given every lecture, every council, and everything like that. So you are our cultural supremo. Now, underneath you, obviously, figuratively, not literally, hopefully, Jane, can we see Jane there, you on the right? You're a vague, shadowy figure. There we are. So we've got Dame Jane Dacre, who's the president of the Royal College of Physicians. Now, she's one of two people that we have here from UCL. And my own university, King's College London, I was here, but then I went on to King's, was founded by the Duke of Wellington to deal with the godless heathens of UCL. So there's godless heathen number one, and godless heathen number two, who is... you, isn't it? Yes, godless heathen number two. Good. So that's Paul Glynn. You are a very rare species of a general physician. I thought you were all dead, but you're clearly not yet. Not yet, but time is to come. But you do lots of various things which will come out. And finally, we have Alex Lyons. Now, you're quite straightforward. You're a cardiologist, aren't you? And you are at Imperial and the Brompton. Okay, so we're talking about the long-term effects and psychological effects of COVID. What a huge subject. We're going to be here all night. But I thought I'm going to start with you, which is the question that we've all got for a cardiologist and COVID. What happened to Christian Eriksen?
Well, Simon, that's a complex question. If you had asked me that before COVID,
right,
I would be thinking he's probably got a genetic disease of his heart that predisposes him to arrhythmias that stop the heart beating. And if your heart stops, you collapse, and it can be fatal, and people die suddenly of these. And they can be genetic diseases of the electrical proteins of the heart that control every heartbeat in our body. As you're all sitting there or listening online, your heart is beating, and there's an electrical wave passing across your heart, and that requires the biological proteins to generate it, and if you have gene mutations, that can lead to sudden death. Alternatively, heart muscle diseases can cause thickening, and there are people who have diseases of the heart muscle causing thickening or weakness that can also lead to arrhythmias. Now, why I also think COVID may be in play with Christian Eriksen is the following. He transferred from Tottenham Hotspur to Inter Milan about 18 months ago on a deal that he's getting paid 10 million euros a year. So as a result, every professional footballer goes through a really detailed assessment, including state-of-the-art cardiac assessment, because the club is buying an asset for 40 to 50 million euros. So they don't want an asset that's already got a heart problem. So if he had a normal assessment, why did he then collapse in that match? And it was right at the end of the first half, and he's a midfielder. He'd been running around for 40 minutes. High excitement representing your country. So you've got a lot of ingredients for sudden death, but he's done that thousands of times in his career. As a cardiologist, I've seen a lot of people with COVID infect and then affect their heart, and some of them didn't know. So while some people are fully aware, because they got COVID, it was pretty obvious, there are people I've looked after who never knowingly had COVID and never had swabs or anything to prove it. And if they have a scar in their heart, it is a potential to then have arrhythmia disturbances. And I don't know this is speculation, but I'd be very interested to know what his cardiac MRI result is, and he will have one as a man who's had a sudden death experience. And if there's a pattern that would be suspicious for a viral infection, I think we'd start to consider he's COVID related.
I don't want to prolong this too much, otherwise everyone in the audience will be absolutely terrified. But he's a professional footballer. He's been tested for COVID probably every second hour. Certainly a huge amount. Come on, they would have known.
Yes, but he's also been moving around a lot more than most of the public who've been generally in lockdown for long periods of the last 15 months. These footballers are going out on their training camps, and we know that even in these bubbles, suddenly out of the blue, someone's positive. You'll enjoy the French rugby team in the Six Nations, where do you remember the lead coach went out night clubbing whilst all the players were in the bubble and came back and brought COVID in. So in life, things happen that you don't predict, and none of these tests are perfect.
Okay, that's a great way to start. So is that true then? None of these tests are perfect? I'm sorry, I should tell everyone. I'm now looking at you, Paul.
Well, I think it's absolutely the case, and we know from the data that exists to date on that there is a significant, a small but significant number of false negatives from PCR testing. So for every group of patients that are tested, there will be a small number who have COVID, but the PCR test is negative. And those patients often are symptomatic and are sent back out into the community without self-isolating, who go on and infect others. So I think that that's well recognized, that's been well published. So I think that my experience is twofold, really. It's first of all looking after acutely ill COVID patients who come through the emergency department. But over the last 12 months, like Alex, I've seen an increasing number of patients who have had very mild COVID illnesses, who develop multiple symptoms and complications, some of which are cardiac. And many of those patients either didn't have access to testing in the first place, or when they had their mild illness were tested negative, some of whom then subsequently were antibody positive, some of whom were antibody negative, but actually have a very distinct clinical presentation and phenotype. So I think it's, in the case of the footballer, it's unusual given the number of tests that would have had to have been false negatives in that case. And I can see your argument. But actually, as a general rule, in the population as a whole, we are seeing many patients who've had negative tests, but clearly had a COVID-like illness and then developed ongoing symptoms, some of which are very debilitating, rendering them unable to work, and many of whom are symptomatic, a year down the line.
Okay, we're going to come back to that towards the end. Now, the theme we've got is what are the long-term and psychological as well, but let's just talk about the general long-term effects of COVID. Now, we could be here all night on that theme. Now, we've just done a bit of football talk. I'm sure my wife, fortunately, can't listen to this because she's in Malta, but she'll already be saying, that's enough football, shut up. So we're going to shut up on that now. And so I'd like to ask each of the panel, just give a little discourse, on, just very short, on what they think is the long-term effect. The idea the world is going to be different, nothing is ever going to be the same again. I'm going to probably challenge a few of those things, as I suspect it's not going to be as different as we think. But we'll go to the the hybrids over there. So Jane, you're a rheumatologist, a clinician, a leader of your profession, and you've watched what's been happening as well, obviously we all have in 18 months. How much would you go on the scale of what would point out something that you think is never going to be the same again in your world? And you can start because in general medicine. That is, if you're still there. She's muted.
I think people are very worried that the world is never going to be the same again. And people were talking about, well, we're going to move into the new normal. But as one of my roles, I'm involved in leadership in running a medical school. And I have to say that there's an awful lot of regression back to the old normal going on. And so although we say things are going to be completely different, people like to do what they like to do, and they don't think change is their friend. And although within the medical school, I don't know what's happening in Cambridge Medical School, but within the medical school, we completely reorganized the way that the undergraduates were trained so that they did a lot of apprenticeship work, and moved away from doing different ologies on different days in classrooms. I have to say I'm a great fan of that because I think that's a really good way to learn medicine. But the world was a bit divided about whether it was a good thing or a bad thing. And there are an awful lot of people who want everything to go back to exactly the same as it was before. So I think there's a huge drag anchor pull to stop things from changing. So if I move on to clinical practice, so I'm a rheumatologist, I'm an outpatient specialist. I am not in the UK at the moment, but I'm still practicing rheumatology because one of the things that my trust has taken 2, 3, 4, 5 years to do is to try and encourage people to do more telephone clinics, remote working, working from different environments against a lot of opposition and a lot of pressure to be present. And suddenly all that went. So there's a huge change in clinical practice. Some love it, some hate it, but patients can now be seen virtually, remotely, on the telephone. Letters can be dictated. The whole thing is extremely efficient. And we're maybe thinking that perhaps we didn't need to get people into transport up to the hospital to have their 5-minute chat with the doctor, and then into transport and back home again, which is actually a very inefficient and old-fashioned way of working. So I think there will be some changes, but I think it will be against the background of everybody wanting to revert to doing what they've always done, which of course will get the results they've always got.
Okay, so you've used the phrase new normal. That's the last time I'll permit anyone to use that phrase. I absolutely loathe it. It may be new, but it's anything but normal. So no more new normals, but Paul, what do you think? I'm looking the wrong way again. I'm hopeless, aren't I? I should be fired already. It's the beer, yeah. So Paul, change then in medicine.
Well, I mean, I agree with what Jane has said, is that COVID has accelerated some of the changes extremely rapidly. So, yeah, I mean, telemedicine is one example. I mean, I remember, actually, I worked for 6 months for a startup, you may have heard of it, called Babylon. And the amount of opposition that there was to online GP
Just
consultations.
Tell us what Babylon is.
Sorry, Babylon is one of the first online platforms for medical consultations via your phone. And so it was a simple way via an app through a subscription service initially to access a GP at a convenient way. So effectively you had a doctor in your pocket, and that was the concept. And I got involved because, in fact, I'm pretty sure it was Millicent who introduced me to the founder of that, if I remember. Thank you, Millicent. But actually it was a really interesting 6 months because I got to work as a jobbing physician. Working in a startup was fascinating because I was by far the oldest person there other than the founder. And I was skeptical, actually. I mean, I was highly skeptical that this was going to be a safe and effective way to deliver medicine. If we fast forward now to where we are, well, there are numerous online providers for primary care services. Babylon has accelerated beyond all my expectations, and the founder has done extremely well. I mean, it's been floated, I think, on the American Stock Exchange or something like that. But so it's been highly,
billion, I believe.
So highly successful. But I think it basically makes the point that actually technology to make access to medicine easier for everybody, I think, is a really good thing. Now, my experience is that it works well in certain areas of medicine, but not in others. And I think for primary care it's good. I think for some specialist medicine, for seeing new patients, it's difficult. But certainly as part of our arsenal of being able to deliver medicine, then it really is transformative. And COVID has been a positive from that perspective because it's really accelerated that change, as it has other aspects of medicine. I mean, certainly I used to be the medical director of UCLH, and one of the reasons why I gave up was because I spent every hour of every day sitting in committees making indecisions. And what I found now with online and Teams and all those things is actually we're much more focused in the meetings that we have far fewer of them, and of course they're much less disruptive to patient care. So I think that's been a huge positive from my perspective. So I agree with Jane.
All right, but in the last few weeks, my wife, who's a senior famous GP, has been getting all sorts of shit in the media, huge amounts, Telegraph, Mail, Express, everybody, for how dreadful it is that no one can see their GP anymore, and how much patients hate all this online nonsense. Been a huge thing. Have you not heard it? Boris Johnson's even said GPs must start seeing patients again.
Well, I think that, as I said, I think there's a place for telemedicine, but it's not a replacement for all consultations. And it is interesting that actually most patients, well, I say most, the majority, actually still would prefer to come and see their doctor in person. Now, it does depend on what the problem is and which age group and demographic. So it's very different for older patients than it is for younger patients. So I think you've got to choose the right patient.
You're assuming that younger patients are happier with a digital world and people like me.
I think it depends what the problem is. I think if you look at the pyramid of interactions with healthcare, you know, the 90% is simple medicine that actually needs a simple solution and doesn't need a complex in-person interaction.
All right.
But actually, the art of telemedicine is being able to triage the patients who then need to be seen face-to-face. So I think if you are trained well and you have the right tools in place for safety netting and making sure patients don't fall through the net if they've got some complex problem, I think it works well.
Well, as I say, we've got a packed house here. So all of it, but they're mainly very young, I have to say, disgustingly young, actually. It's appalling. But how many of you are happy with the current world in which it's, I'm told, it's difficult to see a GP? Are you happy with digital? So put your hands up if you actually prefer digital interactions to real interactions with real health professionals. So if you prefer the way that things seem to be going, just put your hand up now. Okay, no one has actually voted to say they prefer with this. I've got one, there's one, okay, good. That's, we'll multiply by 100. So 100 of us are against. How many of you would still like to see a real person as much as you possibly can? Right, so the motion is clearly carried by about 800 to 100. So I'm sorry about you over there, you're obviously completely out of limb. So, and this is an audience that are supposed to be digitally literate, and unlike, you know, people like me who can't even use email. So I think we've got a bit to go. Okay, so over to you now. Alex, anything that, you know, something changing in medicine that the other two haven't mentioned?
Yes, so cardiology is a mixture of outpatient care but also inpatient care and procedures. And COVID has really affected the way we can deliver efficient care of bringing people into hospital for procedures, pacemakers, defibrillators, stents, and getting them out. And there's some simple challenges. We used to have bays with 6 people in them. Now you can't have 6, you've got to have 4. You've got to do much more deep cleaning between each case, so you can't get as many through at one operating theatre in a day. And what happens to the waiting lists? They get longer, and that's more challenging. Now, whether this is going to be temporary, and that one day we have that vision of a COVID-free life where we can get back, I hope will be the case, but also we therefore have to think about more efficient ways of delivering care. Same day or being admitted on the day of your heart surgery even. Doing everything pre, and then you're not in the hospital for 3 days before your operation. You come in on the morning because everything's been done remotely before. I personally see a hybrid model for my clinics of always seeing the patient face-to-face for that first consultation. That's where you get to know the patient and their personality, who they are, what they like. And then with them, you can decide what works best in the future. Is it ongoing face-to-face or is it remote? In Brompton, about 2/3 to 3/4 of my patients live outside the M25 and travel a long way in, and remote has become very convenient for them. So I think there is definitely lots of advantages, and you think of the environmental savings of that, of people not having to travel into hospitals for their appointments. And many people would have been in a busy NHS outpatient waiting area where there's no seats because there's hundreds of people teeming and they've all got families with them. I don't think that's going to be a world that we'll have. So the people who do come, it'll be a more comfortable environment for them. So I think, like everybody, you can see some advantages. So there is the silver lining, but it's been a pretty awful experience for those of us on the front line. And I think we can also now see there's an awful experience for people in the younger generations who've had COVID, not hospitalised, not been the focus of the statistics on the Today programme every morning, but actually whose lives have been dramatically affected.
Okay. Right, now then, we've got the Baroness, Vice President, Vice Principal, and all those other things, the Queen of Vice, in fact. Deborah, we've been talking about medicine, but obviously we're not the only people affected by this in all sorts of ways, and hit probably worst has been the cultural sector. So to tell us a little bit about how you see the future of recovery or not for the sector in which you've had your career.
Yeah, and it's really hard to know right now because it's a sector that's still very much, in the midst of it. I think it's been a story of inequalities, which is, the whole story of COVID is a story of inequalities, but that's true for the cultural sector too. There was a narrative from the beginning about venues being closed. That was the story, that was what we heard. And it was true, of course. But at the same time, there were arts organizations that were busier than ever. And they were organizations that were based very much in their community, of their community, and which literally pivoted their services in order to meet the needs of their communities. So whether that was around mental health and supporting perhaps older people, whether it was becoming a food bank, which some of them are still doing, notably the Holbeck in Holbeck Moor, whether it was helping with educational catch-up, whether it was actually giving over venues to be, testing centres or now vaccination centres. So we saw this story from the government, this incredible investment from the government, 1.57 billion. It was a massive investment, but it was very much given to what they actually called the crown jewels. So they were protecting the sort of big institutions, but not the bleeding heart, if you like, of the sector, which is the workforce. And it's a sector in which 47% is freelance. And many of those people fell between the gaps of the income support schemes. So what you saw was freelancers losing work. You saw young people under 25 leaving the sector, getting jobs elsewhere. You saw a disproportionate impact on people from diverse backgrounds who, because they were typically in front-facing, public-facing roles, those roles weren't there. And you saw a big impact, of course, on disabled artists and disabled audiences who are still, not confident going back to venues and who will be disproportionately impacted by any COVID vaccination, by a certification scheme. So it has been a story of inequality. There have been remarkable things happening. I mean, the sector has pivoted, there's that word again, we ought to ban that, but to be highly digital and to reach out in really imaginative ways. And I think some of that will continue. But we are in a really difficult position because those venues that had reopened socially distanced were doing so as a loss leader. It is not sustainable. And so the extra month is pretty critical. And, who knows who goes beyond that. And of course, some of the activities, singing with all its breathing and so on, have been deemed to be, not appropriate because of aerosol transmission. So it's hard to know what the long-term impact, the negative long-term impact will likely be on continuing inequalities in the sector. It was never as equal a sector as people like to think it was. You would like to think that the plucky young kid with talent will get there. Actually, the odds are stacked against you from the outset. Your family background, whether you're educated privately or in the state system, will you go to university? Will you be able to afford to do unpaid internships? Are you in the know? All of those things. So I think inequality is going to be exacerbated by this. And of course, I know we're not here to talk about this, but Brexit hasn't yet happened for the cultural sector because touring can't happen right now. And of course, that's going to be another massive impact. So the good thing to say, and I'll shut up after this, is it is a sector in which creativity is rife. Resilience, creativity, and finding ways through. So it will find ways through. Art will always be there. We will always need it, but the workforce has really suffered.
Okay. Technical solutions to some of the problems.
Oh, sorry, Simon, we can't hear you now. You may not be talking to us.
Done something wrong. Okay, I'll just borrow the mic. Okay. We'll just swap mics for 1 second. Better? Okay, I was just about... Yeah, that's better. Good, thank you. I presumably you weren't too pleased with the ad of the ballerina retraining as a GCH spook, were you?
Well, do you know, that was really really interesting, wasn't it? I mean, it was released it was a very old advert, by the way. I mean, I don't know whether you knew that. It didn't
No?
come out at the time. Yeah, it was an old campaign, and somebody decided to re-release it at just that point. So that was a really bad idea. In fact, some research has just come out which has found that a lot of creatives have been upskilling, not reskilling, during the pandemic. So they've been taking the opportunity to enhance their skills within the sector. So, very much their next job will not be in cyber. They are definitely determined to stay, those who are upskilling are determined to stay in the sector. But no, I wasn't very happy with it, really.
I thought you wouldn't be. When we're off mic and the people when we only got you in the audience, I'll tell you a very funny story about GCHQ, but only when we're off mics. Okay, now then, I'll also give everyone in the audience a chance also to do very shortly, but the first thing is I'd also like you just to, whilst you're talking, each of you to mention one word we can all ban. So my word is uptick, which means increase in English. So uptick is the word I want to ban. And I'll give you a chance to think about that. But next time you just say, which post-COVID word would you like never to hear again, including the word COVID? Okay, so over to you. No, but for whatever you want to say now, we're going back around the room. And then I'm going to turn to the audience. We're still thinking about changes, not necessarily just in medicine, but on the fringes of medicine as well.
Well, I mentioned the environment.
Okay.
And in living in London, it was amazing what happened last March, April. Suddenly all this wildlife came from nowhere, and the pollution levels plummeted, and there was no aeroplanes flying overhead, and it was just a revolution. And suddenly it was because there was no traffic in the street and no aeroplanes in the sky. And surely globally we've got to learn that there's an impact of that. And as a doctor, we've seen really weird statistical fluxes in diseases. So as a cardiologist, there was a massive drop in the number of people coming into hospital with heart attacks. And the easy answer was everybody's scared of going into hospital. So they're all at home suffering with chest pain. But then the stroke doctor said it. Then the lung doctor said it. Then the kidney doctor said it. So really, is everyone just not coming into hospital, even if they've got a big stroke causing paralysis? Or are there other factors? And we know that pollution is a big driver of inflammation. That's the immune system being overactive, just grumbling. And that is a cause of disease, and particularly heart disease, and lung disease, and actually rheumatological diseases. So maybe this massive drop in pollution has led to health also improving, and people aren't interacting. Those crammed underground tubes where people are squashing into the last square foot of space in the train to get to work, the stress of that, all that's not going to come back, I don't think, is it? No one's going to accept that it's appropriate to be crammed into a train with lots of other people you've never met.
You got a big audience reaction there. 2 people were nodding vigorously with that last comment. So that's a big audience reaction for tonight.
So I think those factors that might lead to less stress in life and better environmental impacts, I think, will lead to better health.
Only problem is, of course, that road traffic movement is now higher than it was pre-COVID in London.
So there's been the rebound, I know, when we try and get to the hospital in the morning.
Yep. Okay. Over to you, Paul.
Well, I just want to come back on what Alex said. I mean, this is a really complex issue. First of all, I think what you say is a long-term issue, but I cannot believe that the timescale for that would impact on presentations to A&E last year. I mean, I just don't believe that would be the case. And what I do believe is that people were traumatized in that first wave, because the tales that I have heard from countless individuals about how scared people were to even call an ambulance because they literally thought they would die if they went to hospital is extraordinary. And the levels of PTSD, so post-traumatic stress disorder, related to the experience of being told by, whether it's by paramedics, that they shouldn't go to hospital, even though they were clearly requiring hospitalization, that first wave, is quite extraordinary. And I've heard all the stories about, the horror stories about care homes and discharges back to the care homes, of which I was involved in because I was working in the emergency department at University College Hospital. So I was there, I witnessed it all. But the other, the adverse effects of the stuff we didn't see in the hospital, what happened, it's quite traumatic what people went through. Now, I felt lucky because I got to go to work every day. And, it was busy and it was at times stressful. But I think, the impact on the health of the nation from the trauma that was caused across families across the country, I think is quite extraordinary. And what I'm seeing now is, and I can only tell you about my observations, but the level of anxiety and health anxiety that exists, and I'm not talking about patients who've got post-COVID problems, I'm talking about generally people who are coming to the hospital or coming to clinics, is really quite extraordinarily high. And it's palpable in my view. And I think people did stay away, and I think people did die at home with things that they could have been saved with. And it is extraordinary. Only until about a few weeks ago, I always used to walk past the waiting room in the emergency department at UCLH, which has got a glass wall. You said it was always packed. I always used to wonder, why are people sitting there for so long? Packed in, when they were clearly walking around. I could never understand, why would you come to the emergency department and sit there and wait for so long? And then, of course, all of a sudden, overnight, there was nobody in central London. There were no commuters, there were no tourists, there were no students. It was empty. And it did change the pattern of disease presentation. I mean, for example, we saw almost no influenza over the winter at all. But it's only really in the last 2 or 3 weeks where people are now coming back. And then talking about reverting to type, we're seeing, I think people do forget very quickly. They come back, they're sitting there waiting, and I think that trend is clearly happening. But I think in answer to your question, I agree to an extent, but it is complex. And I do think people stayed away, and I think a lot of people with heart attacks and strokes just didn't come in. I really think that, and I think there is data on that in terms of even post-mortem data about what's happened to support that. So it was that first wave particularly was extremely difficult.
Yeah, I mean, my academic world is in epidemiology, and one of the few things about the pandemic is after 30 years, I no longer have to tell people what epidemiology is, because everybody knows. But it is that thing. Because it wasn't just, it was also schizophrenia, deliberate self-harm, all of these things went dramatically down, and people just didn't turn up. And that's because we had the most successful public health campaign ever. The Stay In, Save Lives, Save the NHS was, I think, probably the most dramatic public health campaign. And like everything else, it both saved lives and cost lives. There's never any such thing as a free lunch. Now, Shrin, are you monitoring the airwaves to see if people are desperate to ask us questions? You are. So tell us what's the best question that's come up so far. You're going to need a mic as well. Yeah. And we've also got a gentleman behind you. Perfect. And do me a favour, say who you are.
My name is Annabelle, and I'm interested in going into mental health after studying. And Deborah, you mentioned the inequality in the arts. I wondered what your guys' thoughts were on the inequalities on access to mental health rather than physical health, what the impact of this is going to be on mental health, because you're already seeing an increase in requirements for children, for adolescents, and for adults. So I just wonder what your thoughts were on that.
Okay, Jane, do you want to take that question?
Yeah, but Simon, probably that's something for you,
I know.
isn't it?
I was teasing you. Yes, I know. I know. Okay, all right. I mean, it's not been great. I mean, to do this in 30 seconds, but overall the mental health of the nation changed and it got worse. No shit, Sherlock, you might say. We did surveys to show that, and you can get money for anything really, can't you? So that's certainly true. Most of that will get better as the pandemic declines. So that's the first thing. However, it will then uncover certain areas that have definitely got worse and won't get better so quickly. You mentioned one, the increase in child health problems. Before the pandemic, 1 in 9 children had diagnosable. We can argue about if that was too many or too few, but anyway, 1 in 9 had diagnosable problems. By the middle of the pandemic, it was 1 in 6. And that number seems to be getting worse, actually, for all sorts of reasons that you can all put your fingers on. And we've also seen an unexpected big change in eating disorders that is still unexplained, but it's a true change. Is it because of the beneficial effects of school have been lost? Is it because the chaos of homes when everyone was homeschooling and basically teachers do actually have a role to play, and when that was withdrawn, maybe things didn't go so well in marginalised families, we don't know. So there have been some areas that are longer term problems, mainly in young people, and in fact, although the medical effects of the pandemic are obviously much greater in the old, but the psychological effects have been much greater in the young. And unfortunately, that will be one of the long-term issues that we will grapple with. Most of the rest will almost certainly return to pre-pandemic levels. Last point is to remember that mental health wasn't great before this. So don't have rose-tinted spectacles and say we lived in a wonderful Elysian fields of total happiness before the pandemic struck. As with everything else, the pandemic has just simply made things that weren't great worse. Hasn't created them, it's made them worse. So there you are. That was 45 seconds. Not bad for a lifetime's work, but there we go. Well,
Simon,
so
there's Simon,
Jane.
There is also a thing that I think be interesting to talk about with colleagues, which is the effect on the mental health of the workforce, because the workforce wasn't great before. And there have been very significant problems in the workforce of PTSD, of seeing things that maybe you didn't want to see. We sent a lot of undergraduate medical students into intensive care units to help out with proning. And so a lot of young people saw people die who wouldn't normally have died before. They were frightened for their own safety. There were all sorts of issues about whether or not PPE was adequate at the time. Initially, people weren't vaccinated when they had to go in and care for these patients. So I think there was a very significant effect on a workforce. And if you remember, workforce numbers are low in this country. We have gaps. We have problems with staffing the hospitals already, and the COVID outbreak just stretched that even further. So I think there is a very significant effect of the mental health on the people who were caring for those poor people with COVID.
Okay, good point. Anyone else? Any other from the audience? Yeah, gentleman over there. And just again, just say who you are, and also tell us which word you want to ban if you really want to get extra points.
Can you hear me? Okay. So my name is Alex, and I'm actually a medical graduate. I worked in Oxford at the John Radcliffe in neurology as an overworked SHO for a bit. And now I'm doing a PhD in psychiatry.
Oh, good boy. Well done.
So the question is mainly for Sir Simon, but I think anyone can contribute. First of all, the word I would like to see banned in how it's used these days is the word scientists, because everyone puts all kinds of scientists in the same sort of group, and then I see a lot of skepticism among many people against scientists. And I guess my question is the more controversial aspects of long COVID. So I think this epidemic was a great opportunity for experts such as yourselves to explain that perhaps the dichotomy between physical health and mental health is not so great, because one affects the other. So stress, inflammation, viral illness, post-viral, PTSD, all of those. So I'm wondering, what are your views on long COVID in the young? And do you think there is a psychogenic component? And do you foresee difficulties in the future in tackling that, say with antidepressants? Because I tried to make that point on Twitter once, and I was attacked a lot by chronic fatigue syndrome, the whole community, saying, no, this is not in our head, it's very real. And I kept trying to say, if it's psychological, it can still be real, and it should be taken seriously. So I'm wondering what your views are on this dichotomy, and especially long COVID in the young.
So we've got three real doctors here. I'm obviously the odd man out here, so let's start with you, Paul.
Well, that's a really interesting question. As a general physician, I've spent years seeing patients with medically unexplained symptoms. And so it's been, I would say, a natural progression as a clinician to have started seeing referrals for patients many months ago with multiple unexplained symptoms that followed COVID infection. And without going into too much detail, what our observations are that there are two groups of patients. There are the really acutely sick COVID patients who end up in hospital, the patients with pneumonia who end up in intensive care. But there's another group, a significant group, who were never hospitalized and often had very mild illnesses from which they would often recover. And then weeks or even months down the line would suddenly become sick and relapse with multiple symptoms affecting multiple systems. So neurological problems, neuropsychiatric problems, cardiac problems, respiratory problems, gastrointestinal dysfunction, skin abnormalities. Really complex cases, very debilitating. And that group is quite different from the ones who ended up acutely in the hospital. They are much younger, and the group that I see all the time are aged between 20 and 55. They're predominantly female, so about 75% of the patients are women. And they are quite a different sort of demographic in terms of ethnicity. Much higher proportion of Caucasian, white Caucasian patients in that group, whereas you'll have read that patients who are most at risk of severe acute COVID pneumonia tend to be older, male, often from diverse either African, Caribbean, or Asian backgrounds, and with a history of underlying disease. But the patients that I'm seeing are often extremely fit and well. These are working adults who have not been ill previously. So it is a different group, and it's very debilitating. Now, without taking too much time, all right, what I want to say is that in this group of patients, this is a new disease, and what's been fascinating as a clinician is observing for the first time these new presentations. And so I and colleagues, including Alex, who I work with, we've been very fastidious in recording our observations, and that's been a very useful exercise. But what I've identified is that actually there are very distinct abnormalities that exist in patients who develop these post-COVID syndromes that you can detect if you look in the right place in their blood, but are not there in patients who recover. So I'm absolutely convinced that what we're seeing is a specific disease entity where there is an abnormal or defective immune response to that infection that leads to persistent inflammation that causes all these symptoms. And to come to your specific point, it's complex and it's multifaceted, but the psychology is clearly important. And what we've seen is that consistently in every single case of long COVID or post-COVID, whatever you want to call it, that group of non-hospitalized patients, that there are consistent barriers to recovery. And those barriers are stress and anxiety, which I'm sure are drivers for inflammation. Sleep disruption is a huge problem. Again, that drives inflammation. And patients who either overexert or go back to work too early and overwork, because cognitive activity is akin to doing physical exercise, because there's a lot of neurological problems. And that there. So you have to look at these patients holistically, but I'm absolutely of the view that there is an underlying inflammatory process that is at play. And of course, to ignore the psychology of that would be utterly wrong. But I think you have to be careful how you frame these things, because there still, unfortunately, is a stigma attached to mentioning the word psychology. And I think that the key thing is that psychological well-being is an essential part of facilitating a more rapid recovery in this group of patients.
Good. It's even worse if you mention the word psychiatry, by the way. It's even worse.
That's why I was careful not to.
Yeah, I know. Yes. Good. All right.
Yes, I'm going to echo that, because I've also seen that this is young people, generally previously fit and well. As a cardiologist, seeing people where COVID has infected and then affected their hearts, there's a subgroup of a population who you'd recognize. It's the hyper-fit. The people who love doing triathlons every weekend and go for a 100k cycle ride several times a week. And if you do that when you've got a virus in your blood, maybe it goes to your heart, because we know the heart does get potentially injured with intense exercise, not mild exercise. So I've got these people who were previously the fittest people in the community who are now not for six, can't get out of bed, all these chest pains. And the problem is that a lot of conventional tests can come back normal. And if this first panel of conventional tests with the GP or another specialist are normal, they're just told there's nothing going on. Whereas when you look in detail, that's when you find problems. And half of my clinical practice before COVID is looking after cancer patients who have heart problems. And there's a new revolution of cancer drugs that activate the immune system to target the cancer. But they do weird things to the body, and we've learned that those drugs broke the rules of what we learned in the textbooks at medical school, and you have to have a very high index of suspicion. And COVID seems to do very similar things to the heart as some of those cancer drugs, which activate the immune system. And some of Paul's work on the signature of the immune system in long COVID still being active mimics what those cancer drugs are doing as antibodies blocking it. So it all makes sense. But quite frequently, you'll find that the results come back normal and you're told there's nothing. But if you do the right tests and the right scans, you can then find out there is a problem. And personally, then using treatments to calm the immune system, target it, try and reset it, have been very effective. And I think you've also found that if we use drugs to try and correct the underlying inflammatory process, that actually that is the route. I'd be very interested to hear Jane Dacre as a rheumatologist, because lots of rheumatological illnesses may be triggered by an infection that then propagates because the immune system goes into a sort of auto-activated process. And that's really what we think long COVID is doing.
And before we go to Jane, can I just check with Sharina, are we finishing at 8 or we've got 5 minutes left? Okay. And just to remind Millicent, I'm going to give you the last word if you're still in quarantine at home, or indeed you haven't fallen asleep. So we'll come to you in a few minutes. Okay, Jane, do you want to pick up that last comment from Alex?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with what Alex is saying, and it's been really interesting as a rheumatologist that all of these new drugs on the block are not new drugs necessarily to rheumatologists. Certainly, tocilizumab is one of the drugs that's been found to work, and that's something that we've been using for a while in patients with inflammatory conditions. So, it is interesting that these biologic agents that we're using to suppress the immune system do seem to work in COVID. Now, not all of them do, and not all of the effects are predictable. But one of the things that we've learned as rheumatologists is how complicated the immune response is to inflammation. And there are several different new biologic drugs attacking several different bits of that complex set of pathways. So I think it's quite likely that the answer to helping people with things like long COVID is going to be in these new biologic therapies. I hope so.
All right. But it's not just drugs, whatever type they are, including psychotropic drugs. Deborah, you've done a lot of work on social prescribing, including cultural interventions, etc. Tell us about the kind of totally non-pharmacological interventions and how they can also help in recovery from such conditions as COVID.
I wouldn't presume to talk about their potential role in COVID, but
all right, whatever.
But what we do know is that arts interventions, by which typically one means participation, don't just go and watch something, get involved, can have a significant impact on mental health and well-being, but also on physical challenges. So we're seeing, for instance, dance used in Parkinson's to help with movement. We're seeing dance used as a way of preventing falls in older people. So there are a range of interventions which come under the broad umbrella of social prescribing, but typically they have been trialed only at very, very small scales. So there isn't yet the robust, the evidence is robust, but it's just not big enough to convince NHS quite yet that one would roll out, a course of dance classes as opposed to a course of therapy or a course of drugs. But as you know, Simon, we're doing some work at King's, Wellcome funded work, to try to scale those things up, to really ask the question, are these equally efficacious? Are they doable? Are they implementable? And are they cost effective? Because if they are, you get all the other benefits of engaging in the arts. You get socialization with other people. You get you get the kind of the discipline and the teamwork, and all those things can address holistically rather than just going for the faulty bit of the body or the mind.
Okay, and just to make the point, if you didn't quite hear that, was a lot of these interventions in joint work between King's and UCL, the Godless Heathens up to the north, are very, very methodologically sound trials.
Absolutely, no, they absolutely are, and we're very delighted to have Daisy Fancourt from UCL, who is really one of the leading researchers in this area.
And if I can plug my own book, which no one has ever bought, on the randomized control trial. Unfortunately, only about 18 people have, and I know them all, and none of them are here. But it's still time to buy copies. It's still there on eBay. Okay, so Millicent, where are you? Oh, I know where you are. You're at home. Would you like to finish us off, as it were?
I would love to, thank you. And the word that I am going to ask to be banned is quarantine. So, I just want to thank you so much, Simon. I think you did an amazing job at extracting some really important messages from the panel. And I want to thank the panel as well to give up their time to come both in person and on Zoom. And of course, the audience. And I just want to say finally to not forget about future events for the Union. These are ongoing for the next couple of weeks until end of term. So please join in either in person to the audience or remotely when it goes on YouTube. So thank you again, everybody, for the huge effort tonight and the work you put in. Simon, Paul, Alex, Deborah and Jane, and Sharina for standing in for me. Thank you. Have a great evening.